When it comes to beat-em-ups or retro gaming's legacy in general, few franchises are as legendary as the iconic Streets of Rage. This series of brawlers is fondly remembered for what they brought to the table, with even 2020's fourth Streets of Rage entry living up to many players' lofty expectations. While we always reminisce about how good titles were on the Mega Drive, what we tend to try and ignore sometimes is how badly the third Streets of Rage game performed when it came to both sales and living up to consumers' expectations. Loads of regrettable missteps were taken with regards to the production and publishing of this game, meaning that perhaps in another universe, where we weren't disappointed by this one, we wouldn't have had to wait 26 years between entries. So with all of this said, join me today as we revisit the most controversial release in Streets of Rage history and discuss some of the drama surrounding this sub-optimal experience. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is Streets of Rage 3, the entry that caused outrage. Yeah. The original Streets of Rage game, released back in 1991, was a huge commercial and critical success, and was everything 16-bit Sega console owners could have possibly dreamt of at the time. The game, for a fairly early Mega Drive release, blew the socks off of players, and delivered exactly the sort of experience on the hardware that Final Fight for the Super Nintendo had failed to do. While the Nintendo Final Fight game didn't manage to bring the cooperative arcade experience home of raging through the streets with a friend, in this case the Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Sega saw an opening to easily top the subpar Super Nintendo Final Fight, commissioning a dystopian city brawler of their very own. Unlike Final Fight's console port, Streets of Rage was programmed to offer two-player cooperative play, and was developed to offer more fleshed out fighting mechanics too. The game was hugely popular and gave consumers an early reason to choose a Mega Drive over a Super Nintendo. You could say it would blaze onto the scene. Of course, with any calcium-rich cash cow comes a sequel, but in Streets of Rage 2's case, this would well and truly be the sequel of sequels. When it came to this godly game, Sega went above and beyond to ensure that the second entry in the series was bigger and better than arguably any game that had come before it. Not just home beat-em-ups, but any game period on the Mega Drive platform. Development of this game was a huge undertaking, which becomes all the more impressive the instant you realise that all of this was achieved in just 1 year. Sculpting such an impressive creation was only made possible due to a huge collaborative effort between Sega and 5 other development houses, who all worked in unison to ensure that this title was one of the greatest ever made, a beat 'em up that some believe has still never been topped. History shows us that this plan was executed perfectly, resulting in a title that gamers still only tend to have good things to say about, over 30 years after its release. This was the title that solidified Streets of Rage's legacy forever. Everything about Streets of Rage 2 offers an almost perfect gameplay experience. The game's stunning visuals were painstakingly refined before being approved, and its combat mechanics, heavily influenced by Street Fighter 2, are equally impressive. The experience is elevated further by the exceptional music, mostly composed by Yuzo Koshiro, making the game truly unforgettable. Streets of Rage 2 is a phenomenal game, and its massive commercial success for Sega made the decision to create a third entry in the series a no-brainer. However, this success posed a unique challenge. How do you top a game that is already near perfect? Well, the simple answer is, you can't. So holding such a thought, let's dive into Streets of Rage 3 and examine how Sega approached the formidable challenge of surpassing its predecessors. Known as Bare Knuckaroo 3 in Japan, Streets of Rage 3, like what came before it, was developed under an ambitiously short timeline for such a significant title. Released in Japan in March 1994, just 15 months after its predecessor, it seems that despite a quick turnaround, a tremendous amount of heart and passion was poured into this creation. So much so that not all ideas made it into the final product, as evidenced by an early pre-release screenshot showing a section where players could ride these motorcycles, for example. The game, published by Sega, was once again developed in yet another collaborative effort with Ancient, with Yuzo Koshiro again at the helm, whose contributions we shall speak about more on later in the video. As mentioned earlier, the quality leap between the first 2 Streets of Rage games was substantial, with the second game being significantly more refined. When it came to Streets of Rage 3, Sega and Ancient set out to achieve a similar feat. To realise this, Streets of Rage 3 was programmed to include a more complex plot, character dialogue, even more multiple endings, longer stages, increased difficulty options, more in-depth scenarios, and even faster gameplay. Let's begin to explore these elements and their impact on the game's overall quality. The plot of Streets of Rage 3 once again centres on the series' antagonist, Mr. X, the leader of a dangerous crime syndicate. This time, Mr. X has established a dubious research company known as Robo-Psi Corporation. As part of his sinister scheme, he recruits a doctor, the world's foremost roboticist. Together, they plan to replace every important official in the city with realistic-looking robots, using strategically placed bombs around the city as a distraction for the police. This brings us to the game's character lineup: Axel Stone, Blaze Fielding, and Eddie Skate Hunter, who return to action, joined by a new playable character, Dr. Zan. Dr. Zan, having uncovered the true purpose of Mr. X's research corporation, contacts the trio. United, they set out once more to save the city from Mr. X's nefarious plans. In terms of the title's gameplay, like the previous Streets of Rage games, unsurprisingly this entry is yet another arcade-style side-scrolling beat-em-up, in which up to 2 players must fight their way through the streets, defeating wave upon wave of enemies. The 3 returning characters retain their familiar playstyles from the previous installment. However, the introduction of Dr. Zan adds a fresh dynamic to the gameplay. Dr. Zan, a robot, uniquely converts every weapon pickup into a ball of energy, which he can then use against his enemies. Additionally, Streets of Rage 3 sets itself apart from its predecessors by being the first in the series to include unlockable playable characters, and an extra layer of depth and replayability as well as a topping of controversy, but more on this spiciness soon. But for now, let's delve into the game's level design and narrative progression. The adventure begins with a Star Wars-esque opening text scroll, followed by a selection of playable fighters. Character dialogue boxes then appear, showing the characters debating whether the Dr. Zan is trustworthy as they work to dispose of the city's first bomb. This conversation seamlessly transitions players into the opening stage set in a warehouse. Immediately, players will notice that the game's graphics closely resemble those of Streets of Rage 2. Many of the same enemy sprites are used, and the game seems to run on the same engine. While this might initially seem like a lack of innovation, it also adheres to the principle of not fixing what isn't broken. The familiar visual style preserves the series' established aesthetic and ensures a seamless experience for returning players. While not everything about Streets of Rage 3 screams greatness, its visuals are still top notch. As you progress through the stage, you'll face off against sleek gun-wielding enemies in sharp suits, and as you move further, the action spills outside onto a dock, where the challenge intensifies. The stage keeps you on your toes with a mix of familiar foes from the first game, including menacing motorbike riders. Enemies also make a dramatic entrance via a speedboat, adding to the excitement with a cool watery backdrop effect. As you fight your way through, the passage of time becomes evident, shifting from daylight to a beautiful sunset, setting the stage for the climactic boss battle. This encounter is particularly thrilling as you face the now legendary Shiva. Not only is he a formidable opponent, but you can unlock him as a playable character by holding down the B button after defeating him, adding an extra layer of significance to the showdown. Speaking of Shiva, he was also playable more recently in the excellent Streets of Rage 4 Mr. X's Nightmare DLC. I can get you loads of the modern beat-em-up greats for dirt cheap, including 44% off of the amazing Shredder's Revenge for example. Get games up to 90% cheaper than on Steam and support this very channel simultaneously via using my pinned comment affiliate link. Enjoy your shopping spree. After triumphing over Shiva in the South Pier warehouse stage, the player advances to the electrifying downtown area. The scene opens with a backdrop that pays homage to the iconic settings of the first 2 Streets of Rage games, complete with vibrant neon lights that capture the essence of the second game. Early in this stage, you face a bizarre mid-boss fight against an evil clown and a kangaroo. Defeating these quirky adversaries not only clears your path, but also liberates the kangaroo, who becomes another beloved unlockable character you can use to grow your delightful roster. As action progresses, the next segment takes you into a pulsating nightclub, brimming with lasers, dynamic lighting effects, and an animated crowd that enhances the immersive atmosphere. The lights flicker on and off, creating a strobe effect that intensifies the gameplay and showcases the innovative level design that helps set this experience apart. In the nightclub stage, you engage in a boss fight against the athletic twin sisters, Lisa and Mona. The bar area where this showdown occurs is intricately designed with stunning aquarium walls behind the bars and glass bottles crashing down as the battle rages on. After emerging victorious and discovering a note revealing the Syndicate's whereabouts, the action shifts to the District K construction site for Stage 3. Combat in this stage kicks off with players dodging barrels falling from above, a clear homage to the classic Donkey Kong game. But it's not just the barrels you need to watch out for, there are perilous pits to avoid as well. This stage introduces new challenges beyond just fighting enemies, because as the level progresses, the intensity ramps up. Players must channel their inner Chuck Norris, punching through concrete barriers to evade an unstoppable auto-scrolling bulldozer hurtling towards them. This level design adds a fresh dynamic to the Streets of Rage formula, adding something slightly different from the well-trodden path of most of the series. The next stage plunges players back into familiar territory packed with standard brawler action. Red beams illuminate the path as you navigate a moving lift filled with enemies, delivering classic beat-em-up thrills amidst the dynamic scenery. At the top of a construction site awaits a gripping boss encounter with your character's robotic doppelganger, confirming the truth behind Dr. Zan's warnings. Moving forward, the cast discovers a hidden door leading to an underground stage. Here players must deftly avoid fast-moving railway carts while battling waves of syndicate foes. The environment transitions into a more mine-like setting, adding to the sense of danger and urgency. The climax of this stage is a fierce boss fight against Yamato, a red armoured samurai with the ability to create clones of himself, making for a challenging showdown. While we'll delve deeper into the music later, it's worth noting that this stage features a captivating remix of the opening theme from Revenge of Shinobi, adding a nostalgic twist. After vanquishing Yamato, it becomes clear he was guarding the entrance to the Syndicate's secret hideout. Unexpectedly, the hideout exudes a distinctly Eastern atmosphere, resembling a Yakuza lair more than a New York City crime syndicate base. Although this stylistic choice is visually appealing, it feels somewhat out of place within the game's overall Western theme. Soon, players find themselves battling their way through the opulent corridors of Mr. X's skyscraper. The action kicks off in an elegant hallway, followed by an intense elevator brawl, once again embodying classic beat-em-up excitement. At the top of the tower, Mr. X awaits in his extravagant, gold-plated throne room, reminiscent of Trump Tower. As he watches you fend off waves of enemies, it becomes evident that this encounter is far from a final showdown. The Mr. X you face is in fact another robotic doppelganger. The next stage plunges you deeper into the tower, where you fight through more lavish hallways, this time filled with Terminator-like robots. The challenge escalates as you descend in a lift confronting gangsters, dominatrixes and other familiar foes. This sequence of relentless battles, although very challenging, keeps the adrenaline pumping and sets the stage for the ultimate confrontation. In this stage you rescue the head of the city's police force, adding a heroic twist to your mission. The gameplay then shifts outside the building, where you engage in combat against classic style jetpack wielding adversaries reminiscent of the previous game. The relentless onslaught intensifies until a dramatic moment when Adam, a beloved character from the first Streets of Rage game, makes a surprise entrance. He arrives in a helicopter, gunning down enemies and reuniting with his old friends in a heart-pounding sequence. Moving closer to the game's conclusion, the next level takes you behind enemy lines into a dense woodland-like area, heightening this title's tension as you edge closer to the game's climax. The journey culminates at the RoboPsi Corporation's factory, a labyrinth of moving conveyor belts and guard lasers. Here you face a relentless barrage of both robotic and human opponents, navigating the treacherous terrain, trudging ever closer to the end. After seeing this much of the game, it becomes clear that Streets of Rage 3 has drawn significant inspiration from sci-fi classics like Terminator and RoboCop, marking a shift from the martial arts-centric focus of its predecessors. This influence is evident in the boss fight against Tech, a challenging adversary. However, the stage doesn't end there. Next you encounter the true Mr. X, now reduced to just a brain in a tube, eerily reminiscent of Mother Brain from the Metroid series or Elon Musk from our future. The game's climax features a thrilling final battle against a powerful robot. You must defeat this mechanical menace within 3 minutes to prevent Mr. X from detonating bombs that will obliterate the entire city, and a now-biting sense of urgency when trying to cross the finish line. Upon completing the game, players are treated to different endings based on the difficulty setting, serving up a compelling layer of replayability. This feature encourages gamers to tackle the game again on higher difficulty levels for a new experience. Additionally, the endings are influenced by specific events during the playthrough. For instance, if the player fails to save the police chief in one of the later stages, an alternative final stage unfolds in a location resembling the White House. Here you face off against Shiva once more. Defeating him triggers the bad ending, where he ominously reveals that Mr. X is still watching and plans to finish you off. As shown on the monitor, This dynamic approach to storytelling ensures that different playthroughs have the possibility of offering different outcomes. Examining all the stages in Streets of Rage 3, it's evident that while many elements are recycled from Streets of Rage 2, the game still manages, to some degree at least, to stand on its own. Significant tweaks and additions enhance the overall experience. For instance, previously, only Skate could run, but now all characters have this ability, adding a new layer of agility to combat. Enemy AI has been notably improved. For example, they can now pick up weapons, block attacks, coordinate cooperative attacks, and even steal exposed food items to regain health, making encounters more challenging and dynamic. Additionally, blitz attacks, a staple of the previous game, can be upgraded through successive play. A rechargeable meter allows players to perform special attacks without losing health when full, adding strategic depth. These enhancements ensure that Streets of Rage 3 offers something new for long-term players of these titles. In terms of more pros, the overall level design coupled with engaging dialogue makes the story in Streets of Rage 3 more compelling than ever, providing players with a strong incentive to keep fighting to uncover the game's narrative. This deepens the connection to the plot and enhances the motivation to progress. Another critical aspect worth discussing in any Streets of Rage 3 retrospective is of course the game's controversial music. Composed by the same talented team behind the previous game, the soundtrack plays a vital role in shaping the game's atmosphere. While many players favoured the music from Streets of Rage 2, the composers have noted that the soundtrack for this installment aligns closely with the game's overall theme, contributing to its distinctive feel. One of the series' composers, Motohiro Karashima, states, "With Bare Knuckaroo 3, we got rid of even more of the human element. We were really trying to crank up the meter with what we were making for that game. I think that's what Koshiro-san had in mind. He wanted us to give it a more decadent feel." Yuzo Koshiro himself adds, "It's the kind of soundtrack that leaves you wondering where the melody is. It took a bad beating from listeners at the time. I remember hearing people say that it wasn't even music. It was really experimental, and I made it believing that kind of era was on the horizon." What I find particularly interesting about this quote is how much has changed since I last revisited this story in 2020. Back then it seemed somewhat irrelevant, however living in 2024, where AI generated content has become common, the concept resonates more deeply. We are now in an era where music created entirely by machines is our reality. While the soundtrack of Streets of Rage 3 was widely disliked at the time, I guess the people of the 90s just weren't ready for music like this yet, but their kids were gonna love it. The music in Streets of Rage 3 wasn't the only controversial aspect of the game. With the title's release, there were other big changes, the largest of these being that the Western version of this game had been censored and altered so drastically that you could almost argue that they ended up being two completely different games. A case could be made that this happened in part due to the fact that this was a time when Sega of America was past its prime, and heavy-handed localization policies were rampant. It felt as though Sega were following the same restrictive practices often attributed to Nintendo, which could partially explain why Sony began to dominate the video game industry just a year later. This was certainly a case of Genesis does what Nintendo does. The localization of Bare Knuckaroo 3 into Streets of Rage 3 did more than just censor the game. It often involved completely removing features. The story was significantly altered, resulting in numerous plot holes and missing key scenes. In a bizarre move, Sega of America even increased the difficulty for the international release, likely to prevent consumers from completing it during a rental from Blockbuster Video, thereby encouraging them to purchase the game outright later. Reasons were quickly mounting up for people to feel outraged about this game. Colour changes to sprites led to inconsistencies with the box art, adding to the confusion, and additionally, in a move reminiscent of Nintendo's censorship practices, Sega of America mandated more clothing from scantily clad female characters. Free Stellar Blade? Where is my Free Streets of Rage 3 movement? These extensive changes significantly impacted the game's reception and coherence, dragging it further and further away from the source material. Regarding the localization, Sega of America also removed the mini-boss and secret playable character named Ash, seemingly because they perceived the character to be too homosexual.
Oh, kinky!
I guess the edgy Sega of America weren't quite as edgy as they would try to have you believe. Now, Ash was, in my opinion at least, a hilariously absurd character. Looking like Mr. Slave from South Park, this burly bear would mince around in combat, wearing high-heeled boots, which was made all the more amusing by the fact that this raging homosexual would fight by bitch-slapping his opponents. When grounded by his foes, Ash expresses his emotions more than other fighters too, by literally bursting into tears. The West would have this daddy ripped from their games, with Sega America still hating this character enough to censor him completely out of the Western releases of the Japanese release of Bear Knuckaroo 3 on the Sega Genesis Mini 2. They really do want nothing to do with him. The reason for Ash's removal has never been clarified by Sega, but speculations range from him being taken out of the game due to 90s Americans potentially not wanting scantily clad homosexuals in the games their children were playing, to others believing he was removed due to Ash being a negative stereotype. While both are believable, particularly when we take into account he got censored from the game recently too, let me ask you, is this character really that unrealistic? I've seen plenty of men both dressed and mincing around like this in videos of pride parades in the past. So with that said, let's start the free Streets of Rage 3 movement to stop this outrage and stop gaming censorship. Back in the day, the aggressive alterations to the title led to harsher reviews for the American version of the game. Some reviewers even recommended that gamers import the Japanese version to experience the game as intended, highlighting the extent to which these changes impacted the overall reception. Other review sources were urging gamers not to bother with the American version of the game, and to instead just import the Japanese game so that players could get the real experience. Many reviewers also thought the game was too similar to Streets of Rage 2, with GamePro commenting that the game is little different from previous entries in the series. Not all reviews of the title were negative though, with EGM praising the game for its new moves and large levels, though they did criticise the soundtrack being well below Yuzo Koshiro's usual standards. As a result, they scored the title an average 7.25 out of 10 across the board, with many publications responding similarly. Fast forward to 2024, many years after these controversies took place, as a whole trilogy is viewed favourably. However, in internet land, the third instalment doesn't seem to get the same level of praise as Streets of Rage 2, which is completely fair in all honesty. In my view, the leap in quality from the first game to the second was truly impressive, so much so that replicating it in the third title was simply not possible. However, the censorship and gap in quality between Bear Knuckaroo 3 and Streets of Rage 3 is simply not forgivable. Despite us getting a worse version of the game in the West, which would outrage many of us, a fitting analogy for Streets of Rage's original trilogy would be comparing it to the original Star Wars trilogy. If Streets of Rage 2 is the equivalent to The Empire Strikes Back, then the third installment is akin to Return of the Jedi. Streets of Rage 3 retained many of the qualities that made the second game great, but Yuzo Koshiro's bold and controversial music choices arguably is a major factor that prevented it from reaching the same level of acclaim. The soundtrack is basically the game's Ewoks. Yub-nub indeed. Atmosphere is crucial and music can elevate a game to the next level. Koshiro's arrangements in Streets of Rage 2 were like the perfect seasoning on a medium rare steak, enhancing every aspect of the experience. Although Streets of Rage 3 couldn't quite achieve the same effect, Koshiro still regards the soundtrack as some of his best work, even if it wasn't universally accepted or understood. It reminds me a bit of George Lucas's love for Jar Jar Binks and the Phantom Menace when he said, "I guess I went a little bit too far in places." Despite the localization controversies and backlash, I believe Streets of Rage 3 still managed to serve as a fitting conclusion to the trilogy. This enduring legacy helped fuel the demand for Sega to release Streets of Rage 4. Speaking of which, even if the third game wasn't close to good enough to instantly make Sega commission a follow-up, it was still decent enough to not prevent fans from clamouring for more for nearly 3 decades. Censorship and cutting content from games is rarely well received, and at the time consumers expected better from Sega. Fortunately, we can now easily emulate both versions of the game, which is a small consolation, even if Sega still don't want us to experience the safe embrace of Ash. With that said, back the free Streets of Rage 3 movement now and get up to 90% off some of the big amazing modern beat 'em ups by using my pinned comment. Happy shopping with regards to that. Support the channel and get dirt cheap bargains simultaneously, or if you want more content, I have a big juicy Streets of Rage 4 video for you right now. Click here. Cheerio.